Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. I welcome you to this week's strategic briefing from our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. As we've been covering the situation in the recent weeks, we're seeing growing battles that are going to shape the future for the whole world. On the one side, you have the tremendous potential from the Belt and Road Initiative, the Singapore model, the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. But we're also seeing a really grinding battle in the US over Russiagate, which hit a new turning point possibly this week when President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, came out very combatively and attacked the whole Mueller operation and said that this thing can be turned upside down, it's going to blow up. And we're now seeing more revelations coming out about the role of Christopher Steele from the British MI6 side. So Helga, why don't we start there? These are incredible battles taking place now in the background around Russiagate.
Yeah, I would say that the atmosphere in the United States becomes so hysterical that, you really have the feeling that there is a showdown, between the forces of the British Empire, what we have been discussing now for a whole time, the collusion between the intelligence agencies or heads of agencies of the Obama administration with British intelligence against Trump. And this is escalating. I mean, there is a clear perception in the rest of the world, in Russia, in China, even in North Korea, because there people make a very clear distinction between policies coming from President Trump and policies which even come from high officials in his administration. And, this is obviously designed to prevent Trump from pursuing his North Korea policy, from pursuing his policy with President Putin and, escalating against China. And all of this is extremely dangerous. So I think the only way to change that is, to do exactly what we have published in the United States. Our colleagues have published a new report, The Fish Stinks from the Head. And I would urge all the viewers and you, the audience, to get this report, download it, get it around as far as possible, because it documents exactly, what is wrong with this apparatus. Because now, not only did Giuliani say that this thing will blow up big, but it will blow up it's not about Trump, but it's what they did, meaning, this combination of the Obama intelligence people with the British, and that it will, lead to a new, completely new Watergate and reform. But this is not a guaranteed outcome, because, obviously, what comes out now is, the ongoing British intelligence operation. The Hill had an article 2 days ago where they basically said that Christopher Steele, who supposedly was fired in November 2016 for leaking all this information to the media, in reality kept meeting with Bruce Orr, who was the Deputy Attorney General, about 60 times. And in an exchange of texts, I think it was in August 2017, he basically offered himself to re-enter this whole operation and with Mueller, because this investigation would go too slow. So Rosenstein, the present Deputy Attorney General, claimed that he did not know that Bruce Orr was doing all of this with Christopher Steele. So this is an unbelievable scandal. And this is all described in this article, The Fish Stinks from the Head. And I think that the most important thing one can do to defend the presidency against this coup attempt is to get this information out as wide as possible. Because, this is the battle for the century, because maybe for mankind, because, if and everything is now heating up naturally because of the midterm election, because if the Democrats would win the House, their first step would be to close down all these investigations which are taking place right now in the Congress. And Goodlatte and Gowdy, the two congressmen, have announced that they will subpoena this week everybody who has anything to do with this Christopher Steele operation. Now, that could turn the tide completely, but I think the more people demand that and say things like Giuliani, this is very important to combat the hysteria which is being created otherwise. So I think, this is really important because, if the Democrats would win, they would not only close down the investigation, they would immediately go for impeachment, and you would have back the same apparatus, which was there with Obama and which, with Hillary, and we would be probably, in an unstoppable confrontation with Russia and China. So it's really, a lot at stake. So please get mobilized and work with us to get this information, this article around as widely as possible.
This new article that you're mentioning, The Fish Stinks from the Head, is written by Barbara Boyd, who also wrote the article, the original article on Mueller and his role going back to the 1980s in the Zepp-LaRouche task force. And the circulation of this material, including the work that we have been doing to expose the British connections, Sir Richard Dearlove, Steele, the penetration of this network through people like Brennan and Clapper and then Comey. This has been very instrumental in the openings that have occurred in the Congress. And I would just add that the FISA warrant that Devin Nunes is still trying to get declassified is quite significant. And there's a real push to get Trump, as Giuliani said, to declassify all these documents. We had called for the declassification of every document that had a connection to British intelligence. And I think, Helga, just to reiterate or emphasize your point, if this gets out, it can blow the whole thing up. Now, you mentioned the midterm elections. What can be done to shift this? Because you have a big problem in the Republican Party as well on the Russia-China question. So maybe we should go to that. What do you make of all these sanctions? This is part of the same battle, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this comes from the neocon element in the Trump administration. When Trump tries to get a decent relationship with Russia, naturally, these new sanctions, which were announced because of the so-called Skripal affair, for which there is zero evidence. I think the Russian Foreign Ministry, on the contrary, provided a lot of information about the work of the British Empire and British intelligence. There has been zero proof that Russia was involved. So, now the Russians react to these new sanctions, which potentially target the Russian banking internationally, which naturally is a quite severe escalation. And the Prime Minister Medvedev reacted extremely sharply and said that they have to, regard this as a declaration of economic warfare, that Russia will have to take appropriate countermeasures, and that this could have unforeseeable consequences. Now, I think this is really playing with fire. I mean, Russia could go out of any kind of dollar, go for a completely different kind of financial system, which, is one of the many mines which could blow up the entire system. So, this is really, really dangerous stuff. And, if you look at the the avalanche of sanctions against new sanctions against North Korea, despite the fact, that all indications are that, North Korea is doing everything agreed with between Trump and Kim Jong-un. New sanctions against Iran, new sanctions against Turkey. The question of this priest, who was detained. This is completely out of proportion and can only, drive Turkey further away from the West in the dynamic of the BRICS, because Erdogan already announced in the context of the Johannesburg BRICS summit that Turkey wants to be a member of the BRICS, and the BRICS should be called BRICS with a T in the end, standing for Turkey. Now, if you want to blow up the financial system and you want to blow up NATO, then that is exactly the right thing to do. And, I think that this is a very, very dangerous development. And former US diplomat Jim Justras just pointed to in a lengthy interview in RT, which naturally is regarded by some people as the devil, but it's just a news organ. He pointed to the fact that all these sanctions is just one step before breaking diplomatic relations and going to war. And indeed, if you look at the kind of anti-Russia hysteria and now a growing xenophobia, which the Chinese media have picked up on very clearly, I think this is a very unhealthy thing. This is crazy. And, I mean, in a certain sense, in what world do these people think they live? I mean, what do you want to do to resolve this? Regime change in Russia, in China, in Iran? I think the only way to counter that is to say, if the United States wants to solve the economic problems, if we want to solve the danger of a financial blowout of the entire financial system, we need a four-power agreement to make a new Bretton Woods system, implement the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche. And for that to be successful, you cannot antagonize the very countries which you need to make the kind of reform which is a lifesaver for the whole civilization. So I would really urge our audience to not fall into this anti-Russia, anti-China hysteria, because it can only lead to a catastrophe. And what we need instead is a win-win cooperation with these countries. So, I mean, this is not, I think there's a lot of reason to be worried about that, because as we see, even some of the Trump supporters or some of the, congressmen and others who support Trump and who are working against the British coup, they fall for the propaganda against Russia and China. And in my view, this is based on very little knowledge, about what these countries actually stand for. And I would really urge our viewership to not fall into this hysteria, but to work for a new Bretton Woods system and help us on this mobilization.
And just 2 additional notes on the sanctions question with Russia. When it was announced 2 days ago that these new sanctions are being implemented by the US government over the Skripal affair, Trump said nothing about it. And the media and others were critical of Trump for not taking the lead in pushing this. But I think the other thing that's important is that there's a new Senate bill that's being worked on by the usual suspects, Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Ben Cardin, who was very much involved in the Magnitsky Act. They're talking about new sanctions over the whole question of the allegations that Russia is preparing to intervene in the midterm elections. So this brings up another question, though, on this xenophobia. We still see polls that come out which show that a healthy portion of the American population, in some cases 50 to 60%, want discussion to go on with Russia. They supported the fact that Trump was willing to meet with Putin. And I think this is why we're also seeing now the emergence of a much more aggressive thought police in the United States, attacking the internet and attacking voices that are speaking out against the coup and in favor of the president. And I wonder, Helga, if you have some thoughts on this question of an Orwellian style suppression of truth.
Yeah, this is quite something, because it was the Atlantic Council who signed many months ago an agreement with YouTube to, basically fish out all fake news, basically identifying it as Russian propaganda. So when YouTube and Apple and some others closed down, not only Alex Jones, but also an author from antiwar.com, from the Rand Paul Institute. I mean, this is all directed against, Alex Jones, for example, he attacked Mueller, Robert Mueller, just before this shutdown occurred. So obviously, Alex Jones has 10 million viewers every month. In the last 4 weeks, he had 17 million viewers. 2.4 million on his YouTube channel. I mean, this is obviously against any kind of opposition and dissent. This is a thought control. And I could only hope that enough Americans really counter that and help to undo this, because, you know, I mean, what kind of America will it be if there are only the official opinions? Like, you know, Russia was behind the 2016 election. You cannot question the man-made climate change. You cannot, there's a whole series of formulas and dogmatic beliefs you have to have. And if you have a question or maybe a different scientific opinion, I mean, there are many scientists who have completely different views on the climate change, who look at it from the standpoint of the, you know, long-term cycles of the placement of the solar system in our galaxy over millions and hundreds of millions of years. And there has been always a cycle of ice ages, warming periods, small ice ages. And, you know, the whole idea that it's all due to CO2 emission is questioned by many very serious scientists, who have also proven that the way how the statistics are being used is completely manipulative. So if you can't have a scientific debate, you know, then it's the end of human creativity. I mean, this is worse than Goebbels. You know, this is worse than the Stalin period. I mean, this is. I mean, where is democracy? Where is the freedom of thought? Naturally, YouTube and these other firms claim that they are not bound by the First Amendment because they are private corporations. This was the same argument, by the way, used by the Democratic Party against my husband being included in the election process, despite that he had sufficient votes and delegates to be a candidate, with the argument that the Democratic Party is a private club. I mean, this is, I think, you know, when the people who hold up the banner of democracy and human rights and all of these things, I mean, look at what they are doing. They are banning any dissent. This is thought police. This is absolutely Orwell. And, you know, if this is not being fought, and if people would submit to that, it would be the end of free America, and people should really not let that happen.
The other way this thought control occurs is to keep the American people completely ignorant of what you've been focused on for the last 2 decades, really, which is the global movement for the Belt and Road Initiative, the land bridge, and so on. There's quite a bit going on with that following the summit in South Africa. What is that you have, Helga?
Well, you know, I mean, it's almost that you have two universes because of the leadership of the BRICS, especially China, but also Russia. You know, the whole change in the dynamic in the African continent, you know, there is a completely different kind of motion forward. I think we mentioned that already, but it's really important to reiterate that, you know, because of the new Silk Road spirit, the idea that you replace geopolitical confrontation with a win-win cooperation for joint ventures, for joint economic infrastructure projects, for joint science cooperation, and cultural exchanges, you have right now a changed climate where, for example, you know, the conflict between India and Pakistan can be settled, at least as a realistic chance for really the first time ever. You have a very exciting dynamic between the different countries of the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, who now have all started diplomatic relationship. And this is due to the Chinese railroad building between Djibouti and Addis Abeba. You know, you have for the first time economic development and hope. And this is also going on in many other African countries. So, you know, I mean, rather, and I made the point already in last week that, you know, what is more dangerous than fake news is the censorship by the mainstream media not reporting about these positive developments. And I made the reference to the 20s and the 30s in Germany, where, because of World War II, because of the Versailles Treaty, because of the Great Depression, unemployment, right-left confrontation, people fell into a complete cultural pessimism. They were derooted. They didn't see any options for the future, and this is why the Nazis could take power. So I made the point that, that since there is a widespread cultural pessimism in many of the Western countries, in the United States, the fact that the life expectancy is going down. I mean, this is the clearest economic parameter if an economy is doing well or not. The fact that you have this unbelievable drug epidemic, so many people have a hard time to see any kind of change for the future. Naturally, Trump has promised that he would bring this change, and hopefully he's doing this. He has done incredible things already, given the opposition he's up against. But in Germany, for example, the mainstream media also do not report about the positive things happening around the developing sector. And naturally, therefore, most Germans think there's nothing which can be done anyway, and they fall into cultural pessimism. And I think this is very dangerous, because if people see there is a chance, for the development of Africa, for the reconstruction of Southwest Asia, well, then young people want to be an engineer, a teacher, a doctor, a scientist, and they have hope. But when they only hear in the mainstream media the kind of negative news which are reported, and basically no vision for the future, then the danger is that they fall into cultural pessimism and go for really bad options. So, I think this is really something to be aware of, and I would just encourage people, if YouTube is shutting down certain speakers, you still have the possibility to go to internet sites of African nations, of Latin American nations, of Russia, China, and just make your own judgment. Do not go by what they try to serve you. If you know what to look for, that there is a new world economic order emerging, then you can also verify it yourself. It takes a little bit of work, and naturally help us to spread this webcast, because we are trying to address the issues which are not being addressed otherwise. So help us to get this webcast known among your friends and colleagues and relatives, and just help us to work against this unbelievable effort to keep the people in Western Europe, in Europe and in the United States, in the valley of the clueless. I mean, that was the formulation used for the people in Dresden during the time of the GDR, because people in East Germany, they always would listen to the West TV and radio, except the people in Dresden, because they were, Dresden is situated in a valley, so they couldn't get the Western radio, and therefore they were called the people of the valley of the clueless. And that is the condition of many Americans and Europeans, because if they only listen to the mainstream media, you have no chance, or almost no chance, to get a realistic picture of what the world looks like.
And a lot of what you're describing is the ongoing fight between the emerging new paradigm and the desperate attempt to hold on to the old paradigm. One area where this is clear is in space, where you have the enormous potential, even in Africa now, African countries linking up with China, the Russians working with countries, Vietnam, India, and yet we see how the idea of a space force, which was put forward this week in the United States, is being portrayed as a war against Russia and China. Is that how the Russians and the Chinese see this, the announcement by Vice President Pence this week?
Yes, I think especially the Chinese responded very strongly. I'm sure that there will be some Russian statements coming as well. But what the Chinese basically said, that this is completely unacceptable, that it was clear to all the nations so far that space would be a peaceful place, and that this would reflect an effort by the United States to control the world, to have hegemony over the world. Now, this must not be the last word in it, because, you know, in the late 70s and early 80s, when you had the medium-range missile crisis between the SS-20 and the Pershing II, you know, my husband developed a program which was later called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was basically to make sure that in that time the United States and Russia would work together to make nuclear weapons obsolete through cooperation in space. Now that potential still exists, but you know, that takes a slightly different approach. And you know, in any case, you know, it was admitted that the Space Force is not effective against the hypersonic new missile, the Kinzhal missile of Russia. So there is, you know, obviously an incredible tension right now between those forces who still want to stick to the unipolar world, an unipolar world which de facto does not exist anymore, because, as I have said many times, the dynamic which is right now going on with the BRICS and the Global South countries working together to overcome underdevelopment, this is, in my view, unstoppable, except you want to have World War III. I mean, naturally, you can blow up civilization, and then that settles that question. But obviously, nobody would be the winner, including those who would push such a crazy policy. But, you know, it is really still a possibility that you can, you know, overcome all of these tensions by finding a solution on a higher level, a new paradigm, a win-win cooperation. But it would mean basically that the United States has to clearly accept that, you know, there is this new dynamic, and, you know, if you want to destroy it, you can do it. But the idea that you can stop in any way this new development among these countries, just take the fact that China has been the leading nation of the world for many centuries, and all they are doing right now is to say they want to have again a status as a world leader with a great power relationship, which makes them an equal partner of the United States and others. They do not want to replace the US hegemonic model. If you take India and China together, the two population richest countries in the world, they have together 2.6 billion people. India also is on a very, you know, ambitious path to cooperate with China now in Africa. Japan wants to work with China to develop Africa. If you think you can stop that, I think this is completely absurd. And it's an outmoded thinking. I mean, if you look at the long arc of history, you know, we came from being tribes and you know, scattered few people. That, you know, you had the agricultural revolution, then you had the industrial revolution. Now we are at the beginning of a new age of space cooperation, of, you know, really solving the energies question. If we have thermonuclear fusion, we have security for raw materials and energy for practically the indefinite future. So we are on a completely new branching point of history. However, if we try to stick to the status quo, which is already not defendable anymore, it can only lead to a disaster. What we need is a new thinking. I have always called it the thinking of the coincidence of opposites, the higher level of the one humanity, what Xi Jinping calls the community of a shared future for mankind. We need this kind of new thinking, and that is obviously the total counter to the present anti-Russia and anti-China hysteria. And I would really urge you to, you know, start to think this way, because it's the human way. We are one human species, and the astronauts always say, if you look from a space station down to the Earth, you see the one humanity, and you see how fragile our little blue planet is. And you don't think in terms of world war and geopolitical control, but you think, what can we do to make sure the Earth is not hit by a meteor another one which hit Greenland the other day and reminded us that there are these common aims of mankind we better concentrate on. So I would really urge you, help us to stem against this tide of thought police and crazy efforts by the geopoliticians, to go for a confrontation, and let's have a different approach. Diplomatic solutions are always possible. Dialogue, there is no problem on this planet which cannot be solved through dialogue and diplomacy. And war should not be a means of political conflict resolution anymore. Clausewitz is dead.
Well, two things you can do immediately after watching this webcast. One, join the Schiller Institute to become part of the group of thinkers that are changing the world. And secondly, order your own copy of the new edition of the World Land Bridge Report to give you the details that you need so that you can be a thoughtful leader of people around you to understand exactly what this new paradigm is. So Helga, we've covered a lot. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just want you to become active, because this is, this is a showdown time. If things go wrong, we could be really in a terrible crisis, much worse than the one we have right now. On the other side, if we can defeat this coup, then the United States could be a very beautiful place, and things could